Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and on behalf of Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Advancing Accessibility in Digital Collections, which is sponsored by AM. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit any questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the Show Captions button on the bottom panel of your screen. You can also turn on automated translation for the captions by clicking the arrow button, toggling on translation, and selecting your preferred language. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with links to the recording and today's slides. And with that, we're ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Jessica.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session today, Advancing Accessibility in Digital Collections. When we were planning this session, we thought it would garner a bit of interest. However, we've been humbled by the community with over 1,300 registrants. And it's clear that accessibility in digital collections isn't just a compliance issue or a technical challenge. It's something that's deeply important to our communities, our users, and our mission as libraries, archives, and publishers. My name is Jessica Kowalski, and I'm the Director of Cortex Sales in North America here at AM. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, Cortex is a digital collections publishing platform created by AM. Over the next hour, we're going to explore what accessibility looks like in practice, not just as a checklist or a standard, but as an ongoing collaborative process that spans technology, editorial work, and real-world institutional use. Our aim is that you leave today not only with ideas, but with practical approaches and examples you can apply in your own work. So before we dive in, I want to briefly introduce our speakers. We are very pleased to be joined by Joe Gilling, licensing manager at the British Library, who will share how one of the world's largest research libraries think about accessibility in digital content and partnerships. We're joined by Susanna Coit, archivist and research library assistant at Perkins School for the Blind in Massachusetts. Susanna will share how accessibility is embedded into their digital collections and work, and what it looks like when serving users with diverse and complex needs. And from AM, we're joined by Yasmin Burton-Lall, senior UX designer, who will speak to accessibility with our technology at AM and how we treat accessibility as a continuous design practice. And Rosie Threlfall, site creation and publishing manager, who will focus on accessibility and how it's carried through the editorial decisions we make in content creation. We'll finish with a panel discussion with the Q&A, so please use the Q&A function throughout today's presentation. But to help get you familiar with the conference platform and its features, we also want to take a moment to get to know our audience through a poll. And so we have a poll, and we invite you to participate in it. How confident do you feel discussing accessibility in your work? And I'd like to share that there are no right or wrong answers. And we're just interested in what how you're feeling about accessibility presently. I'm going to just give a moment or two for people to interact with the poll. And we'll take a look and share those results as we go along. Let's see. I see that we have, there's a few people who are very confident, but it seems like most of our attendees here today are feeling quite confident or somewhat confident or not confident at all. And that is all great. I think that our panelists today might even share some of that sentiment, that, there's always more to learn, more that you could be doing with accessibility. And it's really a journey, not an endpoint. So with that, before we turn things over to our guest, I do want to spend a couple of minutes just setting the context of who we are at AM and why accessibility is a central part of our work. At AM, we believe that at the heart of education is the freedom to think critically. For over 30 years, AM has worked with libraries and archives to digitize, publish, and share primary source materials, harnessing technology to help scholars, students, and researchers discover, analyze, and debate the past. And there are three things that really define who AM is. First, we are primary source specialists. We're an independent publisher focused exclusively on primary sources and the technology that supports them. We've worked hand in hand with leading libraries and archives around the world for over 3 decades. Second, we're digital discovery experts. Our platform, Cortex, is purpose-built for archival content and designed not to just display materials, but to support discovery, engagement, and accessibility. And third, we see ourselves as a trusted academic partner. Our work is shaped by long-term relationships with institutions, scholars, and communities, and used globally by researchers, faculty, and students. Accessibility is also closely tied to how we think about purpose-led publishing. We work with partners to steward collections responsibly and without fear of the complex, and we often take on projects others avoid. We are committed to quality and how collections are contextualized and transparency within our work. And critically, we are committed to access. This means considering who is represented in our collections, who is excluded from collections, and how to support meaningful engagement with digital materials for all. In an age of misinformation, primary resources matter more than ever, but they only matter if people can actually use them. And that belief underpins today's session. Accessibility isn't just something that lives in a single platform, feature, or policy document. It's shaped by choices in design, in editorial practice, and in partnerships. Over the last 35 years, the way that people interact with primary resources and archival materials has evolved. From microfilm to online collections, AM too has evolved, and we continue to push the boundaries with innovative technologies such as Cortex that surface new stories and unlock deeper research potential. And with that, I am pleased to hand things over to our first speaker, Joe Gilling from British Library. Joe.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, everybody, or more likely good morning, as I suspect for most of you on the call today. I am Joe Gilling, licensing manager here at the British Library. My job is to develop and work on the sort of large-scale digitization partnerships we have with our various commercial partners around the world, including the likes of AM. And today I'm just going to reflect a little bit on digital accessibility at the British Library, why it's important to us, and how we feel that our internal efforts and those in partnership with our commercial partners, our publishers, are helping to achieve those goals. I can't actually seem to move my slides on, so if someone wouldn't mind just popping me on to the next slide, please. Brilliant, thank you. So to set a little bit of context about who we are the nation's national library. Our collection is now over 175 million individual collection items. It's a collection that grows by 12 linear kilometers of new material every year, which I think is about approximately 7 miles per year of new material. What you can see on this slide is our Knowledge Matters document that we published back in 2023. It's our core principles and our guiding intentions as an institution for where we're heading and what we're planning to do. There is a link on this slide, but it's a very easily discoverable document if you just want to Google it and have a read for yourself to find out about what motivates us and where we're going. The quote on this slide is from Knowledge Matters. Our task of opening up knowledge means that improving access to everything in our collection is more vital than ever. We will make it easier for people to access the collection, to do research on any subject, and develop information literacy skills to confidently evaluate what they discover. Could I move on to the next slide, please? So I think that quote gives you a bit of an understanding about how important accessibility, not just digital, but across all of our collections, how important that is for us as an institution, that people are getting into our material and able to use it in an easy way. So in terms of digital content, we've made a few steps and a few initiatives on our end to try and improve access to our content on our infrastructure platforms. People may be aware on the call, or you perhaps may not, but we underwent quite a significant cyber attack that did a lot of damage to our internal systems a few years ago. And since then, we have been rebuilding a lot of our infrastructure and particularly thinking about how to enable access to digital content whilst we're doing that. So a few of those initiatives, just to touch on them briefly, are remote reader registration and renewal of reader passes. Historically, since the library was established, you'd have to come on site and visit us in person with your documents in order to get a reader ticket. That's no longer the case. Part of that process can be done online. We have introduced staff-mediated access to digital resources in the reading rooms. So if you visit us in person, not only can you look at our physical content and materials, you can also access our entire range, our plethora of digital resources as well. We have started to enact proxy access to digital resources by individuals who have a carer, so we can work with the carer in order to allow that individual to access collections digitally through them. We have, where possible, and subject to the agreement with our suppliers, worked on enabling remote access to our digital resources, access to digital resources on users' own devices, including new assistive technology that plugged into those platforms. We are, of course, limited to a certain degree about what we can do, but we have a provision as a national library to make accessible copies of digital resources. That 7 miles of new material each year is the physical content, but we also receive a huge amount of digital content as well. And we have provision within UK copyright law in certain instances to make accessible copies of that material available to our readers. If I could just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So that's a little bit about what we've been doing internally to try and improve digital accessibility to our own hosted websites, our image collections online, our additional digital resources, and our digital access to journal articles, books, other types of resources. But primarily what my job involves is working with publishing partners. We work with many from across the world to work on large-scale digitization projects that have an output of a digital archive hosted online by that publisher that can then be accessed by researchers and students and institutions across the world. And we do that for a number of reasons. But in terms of what we see as the key benefits in terms of accessibility, there are a few that are really important to us and help us achieve our mission. The first is the global dissemination of British Library content. So we are obviously the British National Library, but we are trying to empower research globally. And by working with partners such as AM, who have presence across the globe in different regions that we don't necessarily have any sort of presence or availability in, we're able to reach a global audience of researchers and academics. And that's really important to us. And we're able to do that through a digital remote access way. We are very cognizant of the fact that a lot of researchers from around the world don't have the sort of research budget that allows them to hop on a flight to London and to stay in a very expensive hotel, because they're all very expensive now in London, to do research on physical items. For some people, that just isn't a possibility. They don't have the budget. And by being able to remotely access large portions of our collection through digital tools, that's really important to us. Also, the sort of contextual supporting material that publishers are able to add, and I'll go into this a little bit later when I talk about one of AM's products, is really important for us, for students to be able to work their way into what can be very complex collections that we hold at the library. We're able to see our collections sit alongside complementary materials from other institutions, variations on the same theme, which is really important to us to give a broader understanding of topics and areas, and to see some of the technological developments that publishers can work on. Publishers are in a slightly freer space in terms of resourcing and funding to be able to experiment with digital tools and to be able to develop some amazing things like alt text or discoverability to improve user experience and to incorporate quite high-tech text recognition software. These are all things that we are very interested in as a library, but we don't necessarily have the resources to be developing ourselves. So by partnering with institutions like AM and like other publishers, they're able to develop these tools and we're able to share some knowledge with them about the success rate of them, what they found is useful for digital accessibility, what's a success, what needs tweaking, and we're able to ingest that information, that knowledge ourselves in partnership. And then with an end result to eventually implement it on our own platforms when available. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight one of these digital archives. We've got many. We've been doing this for nearly 20 years now, I suppose, perhaps slightly over. But one that is a particularly successful partnership we've had with AM, which is the East India Company Archives. This is the digital archive of the famous India Office Records, IOR series, held at the British Library. It started back in 2015. It's been running since then. It's one of the British Library's key strategic partnerships in digitization, mass digitization. And to date, I think it's about 5 million images of content from the India Office Records has been digitized and included on this platform. It's brilliant. It's one of those that really has those global reaches. We are happy to see the data that AM show us about who's using this resource across the world and what sort of people are accessing material from our collections. Next slide, please. And I've just grabbed a few quick screenshots here to help explain some of the things I'm talking about, some of these added digital accessibility benefits that these partnerships bring. So in the top left, I think, is just the front top section of the essays and video interviews page that's on the platform. And these are all those additional, excuse me, those additional resources and materials like accompanying essays or guides to content or videos, some of which from our own British Library experts, explaining about the content, its importance, and how to engage with it. On the right, you can see some of those technological features in terms of hand text recognition, which is a revolutionary way to search handwritten manuscript documents in a way that really empowers research to a speed that was never possible before. You can really hone in across millions of documents on specific words and phrases that are written in handwriting that would otherwise be quite difficult to interpret or perhaps even borderline illegible, particularly for those people that may have visual impairments or difficulties analyzing text like that. So that sort of technological empowerment is really powerful and really impressive to see. On the bottom left, I think, is a snapshot of terminology guides, changing place names, names of people, terminology that is now antiquated and not used. And guides like this allow modern students, particularly who may not be familiar with contextual terms, to reach back into the past and find things more easily, what they're looking for. And a variation on that theme on the bottom right is a guide within the website on how to find people and individuals, particularly important for bringing out those sort of hidden voices, those sort of stories of individuals that aren't necessarily reflected in the metadata, in the finding aid, in our catalogues, that it might take you months, perhaps years of reading through documents to find. But with tools like this, you can pull them out very quickly and expose some of those previously repressed voices. So next slide, please. But I think that's me done. So I'm going to hand over to Susanna.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I'm Susanna Coit, I'm one of the archivists at Perkins School for the Blind in Massachusetts. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we are making our digital collections accessible using AM Cortex. Let's see if... Okay. So inclusion through accessibility is at the core of what Perkins is at the core of Perkins School for the Blind mission, whether it's through our educational programs, our library services, or online content, making online content accessible. For us in the Perkins archives, this means providing access to our digital collections through image descriptions, transcriptions, and other accommodations. There's a sort of feeling or belief that accessible websites often appear as bare bones or overly simple. And thankfully, there are more examples coming out every day that prove that this doesn't have to be true. And Cortex is thankfully one of them. When accessibility is baked into part of the site design from the beginning, it becomes part of that site foundation and isn't something that you have to account for after the fact. At Perkins, and in the archives, our bottom line is that accessibility benefits everyone, and that when your content isn't accessible, you're missing out on users. So by making sure that our content is as accessible as possible and inviting people to contact us if they need a different accommodation than what we're already offering, we're opening our content to them, which is especially important to us since so much of our material is about people who are blind or visually impaired or otherwise disabled, and we want to make sure that they have access to it. Beyond some of our general practices, we have specific strategies for transcription of different kinds of documents to make sure that their unique features are accounted for. So we also have different levels of image descriptions based on the asset type, and I'll give some examples of that in a minute. And digital asset management systems are generally pretty tricky accessibility-wise because they can be very complex and very customizable. We use the customizable parts of Cortex to allow us to change things so that they are more accessible and meet our standards, including things like colors, field order for metadata, font size, and spacing. So as I said, we have standardized practice that we document and make available on our site for our transcriptions. In the documentation, we explain what we're doing and why we're doing it. We use an A to Z list, just an alphabetical list, so that people can easily look up something quickly. For example, if someone wants to know how we indicate when text is underlined, they can go right to the U and find out that we put stars around it. Presenting it this way not only lets people know how we're doing things and what they can expect, but it also raises awareness of those accessibility practices for other people who may be doing transcriptions. We also try to link to examples in our collection when possible so that people can see them in context. So I'm going to give a couple examples of our transcription practice. We treat handwriting differently than published text or printed text, but we start with OCR or optical character recognition for every document as a starting point. Everything that goes through OCR is manually corrected by a human, or mostly with handwritten text, it's transcribed by hand, because we found that that is sort of a good starting point and is usually the way to do it with complex handwriting. The original text is presented as it appears with added information in brackets based on our transcription practices. We generally don't do things like line breaks because it doesn't usually matter or influence the content, and it can make things difficult for screen readers. So that's one sort of formatting change that we make, but text is transcribed as it appears otherwise. So as an example, I have selected Helen Keller's first letter, which was written June 17th, 1887, which was just about 2 months after Anne Sullivan arrived in Tuscumbia, Alabama to start teaching Helen. And fun fact, today is actually Anne Sullivan's birthday. So this is Helen Keller's first handwritten letter. We note in brackets that it is handwritten by Helen Keller and that it is written in what's known as square hand, which is a simple structured writing system for the blind. That's a historically important part of the letter, so we make sure to include that so that it's part of the metadata and transcription. In this case, I'm going to sort of go against what I just said. We included the line breaks in this transcription because it's unclear if Helen was using it as punctuation or not. So it appears verbatim. Helen write Anna, George will give Helen apple, Simpson will shoot bird, Jack will give Helen stick of candy, and so on. The format of the transcription makes it easier to read for a screen reader and just visually than if it's broken up by line breaks and hyphenated words that get split between lines generally. The written June 17th, 1887 is very important information. And it's also just as important that it was not written by Helen Keller. So we make a note that it was written in different handwriting next to the letter in a different direction. And that is a visual cue that can be lost in transcriptions. So we make sure to note if handwriting changes, if something was inserted by hand on a typewritten letter, and indicate those other visual cues in a transcription. We also do image descriptions based on the document or asset type. So 3 common examples we have here is for an asset like this single photograph of a student with what looks like a baseball diamond, maybe Fenway Park. The image description would go into the description field for that asset. For a complex asset, like this issue of The Lens, which is a student magazine that has both text and illustration and images, we put the description of the entire asset in the description field for the whole group. And then any images are described on the image or page level metadata description fields and also included in brackets in the transcription for that page. For an outlier, like this decorative graphic of a sailboat on stationery, the image description would just be included in the transcription in brackets. So we are using Cortex to enhance our digital collection accessibility and using the migration as an opportunity to implement more robust standards and practices for description and metadata and organization of our materials. We have previously and sort of currently have our collections housed on 2 different websites, photographs on one and text materials on another, with no easy way to standardize metadata, correct OCR, or deal with accessibility issues because it's not really within our control. So with Cortex, we're able to apply a more consistent and rigorous accessibility standard and also respond to any issues or make corrections that need to be made in real time. And we are always happy and eager to talk about how we make our archives accessible. So please feel free to reach out. And I'm going to hand it off to Yaz.
Thank you, Susanna. As Jessica mentioned at the start, I'm Yaz, a senior UX designer at AM. I'm just going to go back a slide. Apologies. I've spent the last 10 years working in UX, specializing in digital accessibility. Today, I'll be talking about how we embed accessibility into our working practices at AM and what this means for us as a business. I'll also share an overview of our current accessibility position and the steps we're taking to further improve the accessibility of our platform. So what does accessibility mean to us at AM? At AM, accessibility is embedded throughout the entire product lifecycle, from early design thinking through to development, testing, and iteration. Within the technology department at AM, accessibility is considered from the very start of any new feature. UX designers like myself apply accessibility best practices during design, and then engineers carry those principles through implementation. Accessibility testing is carried out at multiple stages to ensure issues are identified early and addressed effectively. We also invest in accessibility as a capability. Our teams regularly take part in accessibility training and attend webinars led by recognized accessibility experts. We currently have 2 accessibility specialists within the department, including myself, and certified professional in accessibility core competencies accreditation. Bit of a mouthful, that one. Ongoing improvement is driven by regular reviews of our accessibility conformance reports, as well as customer feedback and accessibility related queries. For us, accessibility isn't a one-off task. It's something we continuously learn from and refine. So what does this look like in practice? Well, we design with web content accessibility guidelines, or WCAG for short, requirements in mind from the outset. We use accessible patterns, components, and color contrast checks. We collaborate closely with engineering to ensure designs remain accessible in build. We test with assistive technologies at key stages, and we log, track, and prioritize issues rather than treating them as ad hoc fixes. I wanted to talk a little bit about where we are today. So today we have a clear understanding of the platform's current accessibility status through our accessibility conformance reports, and this is supported by ongoing customer feedback. We've made targeted improvements to address identified issues, and we continue to focus on areas that present the greatest barriers to users. Last year, we introduced a structured accessibility tracking system internally to ensure issues are consistently documented and prioritized. And this approach considers legislation, business value, and most importantly, user impact. This enables us to focus on the changes that deliver the greatest benefit. We've increased our percentage of fully supported WCAG criteria by 17% since the start of 2025, and there will be an update shortly to this as we've made further improvements this year. Where we're going next. So our overall approach is to follow the WCAG 2.2 AA guidelines and to make targeted incremental updates to our platform, as well as continuing to learn and make improvements to our processes to include new and evolving best practices and technologies. We maintain an accessibility roadmap for 2026 that highlights the areas of the platform where change will deliver the most meaningful impact for users. This year, we've already released some improvements to button colors, screen reader announcements, and the advanced search page. Later this year, as part of our ongoing experience enhancement program, we'll be developing an overhaul of our documents list experience. This update will ensure that the documents list, search, and search results user interfaces are fully aligned with our target accessibility standards, delivering an improved and accessible experience for all users. I wanted to end my section by sharing a little bit about why accessibility matters to us at AM. We know at AM that it isn't just about compliance, it's about building products that work for as many people as possible. By embedding accessibility into how we design, build, and prioritize work, we're aiming to create more inclusive, usable experiences for all of our customers. I'm going to hand over to Rosie now, who's going to talk about the content side of things.
Thank you, Yaz. Let me just try and screen it on. There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here to talk to you today. And as Yaz said, I am going to cover the content and editorial accessibility strategy at AM. So you've just heard how accessibility is built into Cortex from a platform perspective. What I want to focus on now is how that work is carried forward by Editorial when it comes to presenting our content. Even a site with the most accessible platform can be completely undermined by poor content structure, unclear labeling, or inconsistent editorial decisions. And we consider accessibility to be a shared responsibility across UX and editorial. Accessibility definitely does not stop at the platform. So the UX team define how things should behave and interact, and then editorial's role is to make sure that our content decisions work within these rules, not against them, so that accessibility is maintained and strengthened as we build and publish our collections. So a recent restructure of our editorial department has seen the creation of a dedicated site creation team. The editors in this team now work solely on the creation of AM and customer sites in Cortex. And this focus has allowed us to upskill and deepen our knowledge of accessibility best practice and legislation, as well as strengthen the ties within our UX team. And I would just say, since the formation of that team last year, we've all really come on leaps and bounds with our confidence in this area, and the team have really been enjoying this work as well, and the difference that we can already see in our some of our live collections. So site creation own the point in the editorial workflow where content, structure, and user experience come together to form the final product that researchers actually interact with. Our role is to take the raw content and turn it into usable, navigable, and inclusive digital experience. That means making intentional decisions about things like structure and hierarchy, navigation and signposting, and language labeling and consistency. So we really don't want to think about accessibility as something that we add on or only check for at the end of our site creation. We've deliberately shifted towards an ethos of accessibility by design, embedding it into editorial decision-making from the very start of a project, rather than treating it as a final compliance check. Although we do still do those too, it's more of a belt and braces approach now. So a lot of accessibility lives in editorial patterns, and these are the repeatable choices that we make across our AM or Cortex customer sites that shape how users understand and move through the content. And some of the most important patterns that we focus on include clear information hierarchy, so using consistent structures so that users can predict where to find things and how content is organized. That's been a big effort for us recently, is consistent. Like, we've got a huge range of collections now, and trying to create more of a consistent user experience across those. Meaningful labeling and plain language, so titles, headings, filters, and descriptions that need to make sense out of context. We publish content that's written by our own editorial team, but also by many academic contributors or archival contributors as well. So making sure that all of the text that we publish is up to these standards. And this is especially important for screen reader users. Consistent navigation models, so repeating patterns across collections, like I said, to build user familiarity and reduce the cognitive load of having to get used to a new site for every AM collection that somebody might visit. And then finally, editorial restraint, so avoiding unnecessary complexity in layouts or language that might look impressive but make content harder to use. And I think that is a shift for us, because we've always liked to make things look as pretty and as visually appealing as possible, but that is not always the most accessible way to make content available. So these patterns benefit all users, but are especially critical for users relying on assistive technologies. So good editorial practice doesn't just support accessibility, it improves usability, comprehension, and research efficiency as well. Go to the next slide. So I just wanted to speak a little bit about the workflow for accessibility at AM. So as I've mentioned, it is considered a continuous workflow. So it's built in during our site planning and structure decisions, whether that's the type of transcription that we're going to make available, or how we might present hierarchies, when editorial patterns are established, and when content is first configured and reviewed. So we have a robust review process for all of our AM collections, and also stakeholder feedback review opportunities for our Cortex customers. And it's reviewed through editorial QA and during acceptance testing, which I've just mentioned, and as part of broader site reviews as well. So not thinking about our individual sites as bespoke entities, but as thinking more about the general direction that we want AM collections to go in. And crucially, the final column is something that we are committed to continuously improving. So we don't see the publication or launch of a site as the end of the process. We're committed to maintaining our products, and we regularly revisit existing sites, especially when maybe new modules are released. So Joe mentioned the newest module of East India Company. So we try and bring older content in line with current accessibility standards and best practice where possible. So we're currently undergoing a full accessibility review of all of our published collections in Cortex. Joe mentioned East India Company, but also another of our kind of flagship collections that had a new module released this year was our Mass Observation Project collection. So that launched a third module, but all of the modules, the site for all modules went under full accessibility review before we launched that latest module. And we also took the opportunity to do a full review of Mass Observation Online as well. As they are such closely related sites, we wanted to make sure that there was a consistent user experience across the two. So it made sense to kind of prioritize that one. And then alongside these improvements to AM collections already in Cortex, we're also committed to completing the migration of all of our backlist titles that are in slightly older platforms into the Cortex platform. And once they're there, they will benefit from the roadmap of improvements that Yaz has outlined. So this approach really recognizes that accessibility standards evolved, that user experience expectations change, and that our own understanding is improving all the time. So although we may have, targets in sight for when we make specific changes, we don't see there being an end to our accessibility efforts, as it's something that we are committed to continually building and improving on. And thank you. I think I'm going to pass back.
Thank you so much, Rosie and Susanna, Joe, Yaz. It's been really fantastic to hear all these different perspectives on accessibility. Really this idea too, it takes a village, all of us working together in order to publish things in a meaningful way for those who wish to access them. We do have a Q&A. We have lots of time for Q&A. So I just want to remind folks to put your questions in. I also see lots of claps and hearts. Seems like people enjoyed hearing from the panel. And so I do want to get into a few questions that we have for you all. We have one question to just kick us off. And maybe Susanna, this would be helpful for to hear from you. What part of your process has made the biggest difference to you and your audience?
That's a really good question. I think we've been focusing a lot on our text documents, and I think one of the biggest difference is that the navigation of those sort of multi-page documents. As it is right now, we have treated a lot of them as having sort of individual pages as photographs on our where they live right now, because we need to make the transcriptions accurate, and that's the best way to do it. But in Cortex, it keeps them together. So when you search a term and it sends you to a page of that volume or document or letter even, you have the context of the other pages instead of having that image surrounded by everything else that matched that search result. So it keeps things in context, which is, of course, very helpful for navigation so that you can see what's in the entire volume instead of just that page in isolation.
Yeah, and there was another question, I think that's, related that perhaps would be suited for you, Suzanne. I think someone actually shared it while you were speaking. They asked about, image description specifically, and whether you see it more as like a science or an art.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because I think it's a little bit of both. And I think it is kind of like an art of science in some cases. And it also depends on what you're writing the image description for. If it's like an infographic, it can seem very scientific in how and there is sort of the science of a formula of how you're presenting the information, what comes first, what goes second, and the formatting of it. But it does kind of turn into an art when you're describing photographs. I think in terms of what is sort of how you're presenting what's in the photograph and going back to the sort of accessibility benefits everyone, there are often times that we notice things in the photographs in the background, or there's one picture in particular of Helen Keller with one of her dogs where it's very subtle, but it looks like she's finger spelling to her dog. And sort of she has her hand by the side of her and she has her fingers in a sort of letter, um, finger spelling form. So that's something that you may miss, but the image description sort of can bring that forward. And as far as best practices, there are all kinds of guides out there. We've sort of it's unfortunately it depends on who your audience is. An image description for a textbook is going to be very different than an image description for an art gallery's digital collection, for example.
Great. Thank you, Susanna. I appreciate that. So there's a question, there's actually lots of questions, so I'm trying to also read through them. I see one, and someone is wondering if the AM team has encountered any interesting anecdotes about how we've managed conflicting UX needs, with the platform. And actually, I think, Yaz, this might be something for you. I know that this is also something I think I spoke with Suzanne and the team at Perkins, that sometimes even competing, like different screen readers can have competing priorities. And so how can you talk about any of our experience with that, Yaz?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a very common thing in the UX world, this kind of choice between having something that looks a particular way, has a certain aesthetic versus having something that is accessible. But I think we're lucky that we're now in the day and age where that isn't so much of a compromise anymore. There is always an accessible route to having something that's also aesthetically pleasing. So we definitely have options sometimes where we have to choose between whether something, looks and feels a bit nicer versus something that is technically better accessibility. But I don't feel like we compromise very much on the accessibility of things. That is one of our, main and top priorities. And the core of usability is something that is usable by everyone, and that means also inclusive and accessible. So I don't have any particular anecdotes, but it's definitely something that we talk about quite often.
I think that sometimes some people are surprised when they see Cortex because it does look very visually pleasing. So the platform that we're using to publish our collections, while still being accessible. And I know that takes a lot of work from you and a lot of consideration from you and our product team members and our engineers. So lots of other questions as well. So let's take a look. There was a question about how does the panel feel about AI being to help with accessibility components? So I don't know if there's something, Rosie or Joe, if you have any input.
Yeah, I can definitely throw in just some thoughts on that. I mean, it's the $1 million question, probably $1 billion question, isn't it, really? And can be applied to almost anything you're talking about. But I think there is a huge amount of potential for AI technologies to enhance the sort of tools we've been talking about today in terms of accessibility. We were just talking about image captions and descriptions. That's something that AI can potentially do. The sort of text recognition software that has been developed is now basically supercharged by AI. I've seen lots of interesting presentations about the use of different LLM softwares in order to improve that recognition accuracy and refine it and make it more accessible. There's a lot of potential, I think, there. I think that for heritage institutions and libraries and archives, it's important to also tread carefully whilst thinking about it. As we all know, generative AI and LLMs has an awful tendency to hallucinate a lot of things and to introduce inaccuracies that were not necessarily there before. So I think the potential is enormous, but the path has to be picked very carefully. And that's certainly from the BL's perspective why it's so good to partner with institutions that take all of these considerations seriously, that aren't gung-ho about it, because there are various companies and actors out there that are pretty gung-ho about it, especially in terms of thinking about the moral consequences of using AI in these ways. So it's great for us as a library to know that we have the same goals as partners and can work in conjunction to develop a path through and implement some of these tools.
Yeah, I would completely agree with everything that Joe said. He's really echoed my thoughts there. And just to add that, yeah, we do take that responsibility very seriously. Obviously, for our AM collections, we are publishing for research purposes, and people expect what we publish to be the truth. So whilst we have seen some seemingly very exciting examples of uses of AI in terms of things like improving transcription, which, you know, if we had, in some magical world, if we had perfect transcription, wouldn't that make our primary sources so much more accessible? But as Joe says, it's the moral and ethical grounds, and then also the just being aware of exactly what the output is. I've seen some, like you say, amazing hallucinations. In fact, I was talking about mass observation earlier, and we obviously running various images through different systems to see, experimenting with what is possible. And one image that we put through was actually blank, or just had a few kind of symbols on it, but either side of it were so mass observation is like a social history project, and all of the sources in that collection are individuals' responses to, like, what they've done with their day, or their response to a like political question. And it just replaced that image with a perfect copy of a mass observation response. I've read millions of responses in mass observation, and it sounded exactly like one. I'd have never known that it was not real, was complete fiction. So yeah, that kind of sums it up for me, and that we do have a huge responsibility to make sure that what we're publishing is an accurate representation of the primary sources.
Thank you, Rosie. Perhaps for Yaz, someone asked specifically about accessibility tools within our digital exhibits. And I thought it might be helpful to talk about the different tools within Cortex, whether it's digital exhibits or other kinds of contextualization that we're publishing, and how accessibility extends to that kind of material.
Yeah, sure. So exhibits actually is a very interesting one, because we recognized that there were a few accessibility issues with the exhibits, and we've done quite a bit of work to kind of improve those over the last year. It's definitely still an area which we're hoping to improve, and we understand that it's something that is quite useful, a useful way of kind of seeing the information in a different kind of context, and so we want to ensure that that is as accessible as possible. I suppose when I'm thinking about other ways that content can kind of be driven by accessibility is kind of the addition of audio description tracks. Obviously, we've heard a lot about transcripts today. Those are kind of the main areas that I think are great to highlight, and they're a great addition to the platform that allows us to add an extra layer of accessibility to our already great content.
Thanks, Yaz. I also think of other kinds of projects that AM has published. For example, there's been times at which we've published interactive maps and thinking about when we published those, we actually learned that actually just colors themselves weren't enough to differentiate some of the areas that we're viewing on a map. So using lines and dots and other kinds of things to help people to be able to, other visual cues to help indicate where on the map that they're interacting with. Digital exhibits and Cortex is actually quite broad in that we have a digital exhibition feature. We also have timelines, or you can build a page. And so it's really thinking about accessibility at its core, how every feature within Cortex is accessible. So you can build an exhibit the way it will benefit your content. Susanna, I do have a question for you. Do you work with your users in your community to improve accessibility? What's that relationship like?
Sure. So before we launched, in addition to the Cortex accessibility review, we met with, or we sort of pulled together a review team of our own of colleagues and some members of the community who are visually impaired or have other disabilities to review the site and sort of see how it worked for them. We don't do anything formal. It's more, we invite almost on, I think on just about every collection page, we invite people to contact us if they need additional accommodations, or if there's a transcript that isn't available that they need, we encourage them to reach out to us.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if Joe or perhaps Rosie also, if you have any thoughts or insights there that you want to add. While you're thinking, I'll share more broadly, as someone that's working with our Cortex partners, so specifically Susanna and Perkins School for the Blind, AM is very collaborative in that sense that we're pulling in people to have conversations with Yaz or our product team, sharing feedback so that we can improve the platform for everyone, which also relates to the collections that we publish, where Joe and Rosie might be collaborating on. Joe, did I see that you're about to unmic yourself? There you go.
Yeah, just I think for us, obviously for our own platforms, we're very engaged with receiving feedback from our readers. We're very reader focused, be that physically in the library itself, in the reading rooms, or through our digital access. And when it comes to partnerships, I think a benefit is that we're able to see not just sort of anecdotal feedback, but statistical data from AM as well to prove that tools are working well, that accessibility is working, particularly in the dissemination of our content and its reach to different institutions around the world. It's brilliant to be able to see that sort of feedback coming back through AM and partners to us to review. So that's really interesting to see.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then
yeah.
Sorry, Jessica, I was just going to add that as well as there being channels for feedback to come back to Editorial from our sales colleagues who are on the ground with these collections, I have found that it's also been really interesting for us since we started not only building AM collection sites but also working with Cortex customers, because we're hearing their experience of using the platform and their accessibility concerns as well, which sometimes come from a slightly different place to us. So that's a really great opportunity we found already to be able to pass knowledge back and forth from our editorial team to their archival teams as well, which has been really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I know our partners really appreciate that, also being able to get your experience, and that's really part of the community of AM. It's us being able to have these kinds of conversations quite collaboratively. There is a question, while we have just a moment or two left, about making difficult decisions and making sites accessible. And have there been any trade-offs or times where a difficult decision has had to be made? And how do you prioritize that and navigate that decision-making process? So I don't know if there's anyone that wants to raise their hand first to answer that, but I did think it was an interesting question about prioritization.
I can speak a little bit to that. I saw that somebody had replied by the Q&A to say that their team had difficulty getting on board, where accessibility updates maybe weren't as visually appealing. And I think I can layer on top of that the fact that sometimes there's a sense of like change and moving on from the way we've done things in the past. And for us, we have had to retire some of our features that we've had for a long time because they're not accessible. So, for example, we've just completed an editorial accessibility review of our entire Archives Direct product line, product suite. And as part of that, we removed our map feature, which was like a interactive spinning globe, and you could click on a different country to see a list of documents. And we've had that in Archives Direct for a very long time, and it's kind of it maybe already slightly looked a bit dated, but it felt like it was like a part of the character of that product line and something that everybody was familiar with. But it just it wasn't accessible anymore, and it wasn't possible to update it to make it conform with accessibility standards. So it had to go, and we just have to be happy with the forward progress there.
Thank you, Rosie. I do see that we're at noon. There's lots of other questions, also questions about bots and copyright and all sorts of really interesting topics. We will be able to follow up with folks individually. There's also opportunity where you can reach out to us. I know our panelists would also like to talk more about their projects and their experience with accessibility. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure. And I'll turn things over to Sabrina.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, I'll just say thanks so much to Jessica, Joe, Susanna, Yaz, and Rosie for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your great questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with links to the recording and the slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the webinar and hope to see you again soon on another session. Thanks, everyone.